I am absolutely honored to have a friend of the channel back on, the incredible Jason Marsalis. I've been checking him out a lot more since he came on the channel. What an incredible player. I've been picking up brush tips from you, master, master brush master, vibes master. This is the guy. And of course, many people recently have said I should have a conversation with Jason regarding the whole BAM thing, Black American music. So we're going to have an open discussion. I'm sure he's going to set me straight on some things, but we're going to get right into it in discussing if jazz is black music. So what do you think, Jason?
Yeah. Well, first, hello. It's great to be on here. Um, and it's an interesting thing because my take on it at the end of the day is that it was music, it was music that was created by Black people, but I actually see it more as American music
Yeah.
because there's been some, just because I think that ironically enough, when you put it as Black American music, it's almost like putting it into like this subcategory in a lot of ways. But I also want to talk about why that happens. Like, because I think there's reasons as to why it happens, but I see it more as American music. I think that there have been influences from all people from all over the world into the music, but I think the reason that these kind of conversations happen, whether like people not liking the word jazz or people having to declare it Black American music, I think the reason uh, is that a lot of the people that are in charge of, for lack of a better word, the systems have been white. And what happens is that they usually end up controlling the narrative, those that are in charge. Now, here's the thing though. I do not include the musicians in that. That's I think one thing that sometimes gets overlooked. Like I don't include the musicians in that it's a different set of people that's in charge of that. Like let me think of like here's an example. Uh, so in American history, for instance, like one of the more interesting events is the story about the trumpeter Freddie Kemper. Freddie Kemper, who was in the early 1900s, had the chance to make the first jazz record,
That's right.
but he didn't want to do it because he was afraid that that folks were going to steal his ideas and steal his stuff and all this other stuff. And some of that I think might have been a certain paranoia, but there has been instances of people that are white that do come in and take ideas and either claim credit for it or justify it through someone that's white. Unfortunately, the systems have had that happen. And ironically, the first jazz record ended up being a white band anyway. And it's funny because that was the band, the original Dixieland jazz band with the trumpeter Nick LaRocca. And do you know much about Nick LaRocca?
I have studied. See, I'm going to be pushing against you a little bit here because obviously I think you're going to bring up the fact that Nick LaRocca said that black people had nothing to do with the creation of jazz. It was pretty much a bunch of white people in New Orleans, which is absolutely preposterous.
Oh, of course, but
Yeah.
but there's more to the story though,
Oh, please
because
tell. Go on.
because like when I was coming along, all of a sudden you'd have Nick LaRocca's family coming in and try to claim that no, Nick LaRocca's the one that ought to be getting credit for this music. Nick LaRocca's the one. And there's like it's like his family, and there are people that have stories of that. His family coming in and taking credit for, or trying to say he should be the one credited. And so, in fact, I remember once a friend of my late father's, this was some years ago, was talking about that, said, man, this dude was on the radio talking about Nick LaRocca being this, the creator of the music. Man, have you ever heard of anybody transcribing a Nick LaRocca solo? So yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, like even in recent years, like there's stories of his family coming in and saying that he should be so. But I think that you've had those, and I don't see them as musicians, but those that are in charge of the systems, like in charge of the record labels or in charge of the publications that set the narrative. So, for example, when Benny Goodman was called the King of Swing. Benny Goodman didn't do that. you
No.
know, Benny Goodman was, in fact, Benny Goodman's music was in the very beginning was kind of floundering for a little bit until he was playing one of Fletcher Henderson's arrangements and playing Jelly Roll Morton's music. And it was like, oh, okay. Now the people that are in charge of the marketing in the
Mm.
system, they're the ones deciding, oh yeah, let's call him the King of Swing. Yeah, Benny Goodman is not doing that. So that's what I mean by those who are in charge of the systems, if that makes sense. And I think that's why people sometimes talk
Yeah,
about like,
I could understand that's driving it. One of the I've objected this on two grounds. One of them is being British and knowing what the British jazz scene is like. It starts to
yeah,
throw up all sorts of different problems, and here's a couple of the problems. Is obviously we got the British jazz scene, and if it's Black American music, what about the black musicians in the UK? Are they part of that group? And as soon as you start arguing that, I do have this feeling go, this seems to be getting territorial now. It seems to be, some people say this is our music. And I had so many arguments with people saying, you can't talk about this. This is our music. You're trying to take the music off you. And I was thinking, I've always felt that the whole thing about jazz, it just opens its arms up, which is why it's not some local New Orleans thing. It starts off there, but then once it's let out, it takes the whole
yeah,
world over. And next,
yeah.
before you know it, you've got Django Reinhardt and Stefan Grappelli, and then you've got musicians all over the world playing it because
Oh
it's an
yeah,
open arm form. And I think it's a little bit territorial. But the other thing is, it's deeply going into the history. This is what I want to talk to you because everyone said to me, "You've never been to New Orleans," which is true. You're not from there. You don't understand it. In looking at the history, I can see all sorts of different groups of people in New Orleans at the beginning of jazz history. And to call that black, I think is a little bit it's not nuanced enough because you've got white bands, you've got Papa Jack Lane, and they go right back to the 1880s. You've got black bands going, like Excelsior, they're going right back to the 1880s. You've got all the
right.
Creole, and of course, Creole can contain white people and black people. You've got
Oh
black
yeah,
people who are light skinned jumping into Papa Jack Lane's band. And so,
yeah,
what I see is let's celebrate the fact that what was going on in New Orleans. It wasn't a fluke that it was the biggest cultural melting pot in the world at the time, and
yeah,
so this is a music of integration. Now I think there's a special argument that what black musicians put into it is like an X factor. I've said this all along. There's an X factor that's put in by black musicians, but I think this negates the genius of musicians like Louis Armstrong, because I think you get up until original Dixieland Jazz Band, a lot of those early jazz groups, the sophistication is created when the recording comes in. You've got people like Sidney Bechet, who's a sophisticated player, but
hmm,
you've got, like the Tio family, Lorenzo Tio, you've got all those influences coming in.
yeah,
But the real genius of jazz for me is Louis Armstrong. He seems to pull everything together. Jelly Roll Morton to some extent. How do you think about that take? And I'll take what you say because you know more about it than me. But that's where I've arrived at.
yeah. Well, I think that Louis Armstrong did set the standard, if you will. And he was obviously not the first to do it. I mean, he looked up to so, and it was a music that did take from different cultures, and there was a lot of elements from, and it was like I think when you mentioned the music of integration, it was that sort of thing. But I think once again, when you get these systems that get
Yeah,
involved, and then like those who own the newspapers and they're trying to either put a narrative on this or saying that, well, this is not a sophisticated music or this isn't like real music or like that's where, but it's people that are in charge of the systems, not the musicians, if that makes sense. But yeah, Louis Armstrong definitely did set the standard for where all of American music went,
all of
because I
it. And I
think
think
that,
the thing that no one ever says about Louis Armstrong, he understood the recording process. As sort of stuff got recorded, he went, well, we can organize this and create it into a high entertainment as well as being a high art. I put Louis Armstrong at, records on from 1926, and I
yeah,
enjoy them because he's telling jokes and he's doing voiceovers and there's story. It's like a little play going on sometimes with these little these little things
yeah,
going on, and also he sometimes he seems to mock jazz because he's so much cooler. That you know that thing he does where it'll come in and it's quite uptight, and then he'll sort of just take the music, so I can say it's really fast, for example, and then he comes in and goes bap bap
Oh yeah.
bap and you go whoa, and it's and I see this is a things I have a problem with. There's this
Hmm.
idea, and everyone said this. They said that the Creoles and the whites, they were highly trained. The blacks, they had the soul. They were off the street and they had the soul. I go digging and I start
Yeah.
listening to James Europe. James Europe is about as sophisticated as it gets. Insane
James E.
arrangements,
Europe.
5/4, all this stuff. Black musicians, highly trained. Papa Jack Lane's band, only one guy could read in that band.
Yeah.
Then you got the spasm bands making their own instruments, and so I'm sure it was a far more complex in terms of say, oh, the black people it's this sort of noble savage thing almost. And I've
Oh
never
yeah.
heard that. I like to look at Louis Armstrong and these early players and go, where's this coming from? This is sophisticated. Where and the mystery is not explained to me with the
Yeah.
existing history.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, here's the thing. And there's been, yeah, in terms like there's been that narrative, I think, about black people is something that's been around for a while. And I mean, in fact, it was a quote that that was found, I think, of it was an old quote saying that like the Negro he's just a natural musician. He can just come up with songs and he can just create these things. And and it was old. It was like, I don't know, like 1700s. It was a long time ago. And it's that whole thing of, oh yeah, the whole thing of, oh, they're just naturally gifted and they can just, like instead of there's some that learn music fully, there's some that learn it informally, there's some, but and that's how that is. And you can be black or white. That can be true. But then it turns into, well, the black musicians are just, they just figure it out. And in a lot of ways, it's what you're doing is that you're putting black people in a place.
That's what I feel. The whole thing, and it's not. People think I'm being some white supremacist saying this, but I'm saying, well, look at the history. I got no problem calling jazz black music. It's not that. It's just, but when you get into the history, I would like to be able to ask questions about the history. So one of the things that I think the original Dixieland Jazz Band, like it or not, that record sold 1 million copies. If
Yeah.
it hadn't, that like you say, the white record business that was just emerging wouldn't have gone and signed up people like Louis Armstrong and King Oliver and all these people in the 1920s. Jelly Roll Morton. They wouldn't have got signed.
Oh
And
yeah. And
I mean,
yeah,
and the
that
thing
that's
is, there are jazz recordings before it. There's jazz recordings before it, but the trouble is that they don't swing.
right. Oh yeah, that's the
ODJ,
thing.
ODJB were the first band to swing. Now we know where they got that from, but those musicians have been around for a while, But it's like, oh, I'm a drummer. Where's that coming from? It goes back to DD Chandler, doesn't it? It goes back to those bands, so we can see all that. But sometimes it's like another thing that surprised me, really researching into this, was how much respect Louis Armstrong had for the original Dixieland Jazz Band. And he really felt
Mhm.
when he first came up as like he was 10 years old, 11 years old, he thought they were one of the greatest bands in New Orleans. And I think so everybody's getting maligned all the way through because everybody wants to be put in boxes. And I think what you say is a lot more useful to go, this is the great American music form.
Yeah.
It's the great American music form, and it's really born out of Reconstruction. You think,
Oh yeah, and the thing about Reconstruction though is, and this is another thing, is that one of the reasons there's even an argument about like racism versus prejudice is that it has to do with those in charge of the systems. And what happened with Reconstruction was, and this is why it is that America is in such turmoil now, and of course
turmoil
considering
right now. I mean, it's
over
it
the
still
over
won't go away.
Oh yeah, and considering the news over what's going on, like right now with presidential election, oh yeah, it's it's still there. But the thing about it is that there was this thought, I don't want to say thought process, but I think that when you had people that were white that were in charge of well, once, I mean, you had those who were in charge of slavery, obviously, but those who are in charge of banks and in charge of government and whatever, there came a belief that if you were black, you didn't belong there. You didn't belong in government, or you did not deserve to be an owner of anything. And so during Reconstruction, there's a lot of stories that were buried. In fact, there was even a story that only came out in recent years. And I think that's why there's a lot of turmoil, because there's a lot of stories that's coming out, and you have people that don't want to talk about these stories. I'll give you one example. And it was Wilmington, North Carolina, where there was a story about their oh man, during Reconstruction, there was a fusion party that ran for these like House seats in government, and it was a mix of blacks, whites, Native Americans, and they won a lot of seats. And so in government, you had this mixed government, and you had these people that were white that hated it. They were like, no, they don't belong here. We got to figure out how to reverse this and start using hatred tactics, which are still being
Still
used.
being used right now.
Yeah. And about to stoke fear. I even told a joke. Yeah, they went into a time machine and watched TV today and came back. But yeah, because it's like the same techniques, but they use these attacks. And so the next time they had elections, you had more whites that won, but there was still some from this fusion party that was there. And so finally, and they even had a black man that actually owned his own paper and would print articles from his perspective. And man, finally, after a while, there was some of them guys in government came in with guns. I guess this is what the right to bear arms is really about. They came with guns and said, okay, y'all fusion, get out right now.
Yeah,
And
I read all about this, and this is what I thought. This is discussion we have to have about jazz, because to me, after the American Civil War, there seems to be a pressure for proper integration, for equal rights for everybody. It's there. And then these American forces creep back in. And before you know it, you've got people going down, and the politicians that are making headway, they get just getting shot. The Ku Klux Klan emerges. You've got all that going on. And then suddenly you have Homer Plessy getting on that getting on the rail carriage,
yep.
sitting in the white section. And then they say, look, we're not saying black people aren't that they're not equal. We're not saying that they are equal with whites, but they need to be kept separate. And that was the bloody death knell for black people in America. And that bottleneck, I think, especially the status of Creoles, the sort of up and down status of
Oh yeah,
Creoles,
yeah,
is
yeah.
the pressure point which forces jazz to come out. And what's wonderful about jazz is it comes out as an integrational form. It's not standing there saying, no, we're this group and we're that group. Complete opposite of what you have politically at the moment. Jazz it comes out as this sort of beautiful form that it's like, well, anyone can get involved in this.
Yeah.
But all you've got to do is have this feel. You've got to have this swing. You've got to be able to feel the blues. But everyone could do it. I've always felt that with jazz. It goes around the whole world. And I looking at American history more deeply and being on the outside, your country seems to weave in. And so when I see the BAM thing, I can't help but thinking, isn't this just pushing for Jim Crow? Isn't it like we'll have the black people here, they've got their territory here, the white people here, they're perfectly good, separate but equal. You can play the
Right.
jazz.
Yeah, it's not quite that. I mean, I understand the question, but it's not quite that. I think that yeah, because Nicholas Payton has even said himself, like you've had whites play this music, they can play this music. I think that it was him trying to acknowledge who the creators and ancestors are, and I think it's just now you could argue that maybe it's a reaction to another kind of narrative, but that's
That's what I
also
think it is. I think it's a reaction
yeah,
to
I
another kind
think
of narrative.
yeah,
And
because
I
I
think
think
it's
that
it's a communitarian narrative where they're trying to understand history from a cultural identity point of view. And the problem with that for me, it negates individual genius. And I think jazz is about individual genius. And I think Art Tatum and Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, you know, Freddie Keppard, Sidney
yeah,
Bechet, they're all individual geniuses, and they're all actually entirely different. And if you love jazz, that's what you understand because That Sidney
Yeah.
Bechet is like this loner, and then Louis Armstrong is like this big open, and there's those you can feel that, but also you've got Big Spiderbeck and you've got like
Mhm.
Django Reinhardt, Stefan Grappelli, all these other musicians,
Yeah.
and I just think everybody's involved all the way through the history of jazz. Everybody's involved, but out of this emerges a thing which I would call blackness. There's a Rassan Roland Kirk album I've got in the
Yeah.
70s called Blackness, NUSS, and I think that's the thing. That's the thing we should be talking about, and that is equivalent almost like the word soul. There's something in there which is so powerful, but reaches out to me like a white guy in the UK. Reaches out all. I mean,
Yeah.
jazz is like the most important. When I was a little kid and I heard it, and my dad played it all the time. I can't tell you how if I hear jazz, if I hear like Ella Fitzgerald or Duke Ellington, I'm totally at home. I'm absolutely at home.
Yeah.
And so it does rankle a bit to people say, yeah, but you can't talk about this music, Andy, or you can't say that. You don't know anything about the history. I don't find it welcoming. It doesn't seem to have the spirit of jazz.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that, I mean, one, and I think I know why this happens, is that, I mean, one, you are a person that actually has checked out the music and really knows about it. And so I think that, the conversations are worthwhile here. Unfortunately, you have had historically like these jazz writers that don't really know the music, but they're writing about it and they're making these comments. And a lot of times the stuff isn't accurate, but they're part of the magazines and they can shape narratives. And so I think that it's in relationship to that. I mean, you're someone that actually does play and knows the music, so it's different than say someone that just doesn't get it. Like, for example, there was even a review, I think, in Downbeat magazine, and this was years ago, of the pianist Ahmad Jamal, and it was said that they had given him negative reviews and called him a cocktail pianist and so forth. But what's funny though is that lingers. Like, after a while, people quote that, like, "Oh yeah, well, they had said he was a cocktail pianist," and it like sticks.
Six, yeah.
It
And
just,
I
and
mean,
you're like,
I've just had
that wasn't what it was at all.
I've been chatting to a British jazz pianist called Wendy Kirkland this afternoon, and she said, who did you listen to coming up? And she said Oscar Peterson, and I said everybody did Oscar Peterson. It's and yet I don't feel like there's the same. He's not in the same breath as like Sonny Rollins or Bud Powell, and I don't understand what that is. As though Oscar Peterson is what is he, middle of the road? Or I can't hear that.
Yeah,
It's,
well, here's actually and okay, here's the assessment I have of Oscar Peterson. I think that Oscar Peterson was one who, he did have incredible technique, but I think it was in a way that people understood it. And I think that a lot of folks could just relate to that. It's
yeah.
almost like it's musician friendly in a way. I mean, honest, and I think OP's great too. But honestly, I don't even see him on the level as an Ahmad Jamal, honestly, because Ahmad, and I guess I'm talking about Ahmad because we just did this tribute
Yeah, you've
show.
just done this tribute to him. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I even remember, um, even when I started to get into Ahmad Jamal, which was back in high school, and like these arrangements he would come up with, which were just incredible, and the way that he would use space, the way he would organize the music, the way, and like I remember musicians and we would have these discussions about these Ahmad records, and like, man, you checked out so and so, man, I got to get you a tape of this record. That, I mean, we would have these conversations about like the music and what he was doing. I mean, we listen to Oscar Peterson too. But I just think with Ahmad, it was like another
Mm.
level. And I think sometimes people don't get the concept of what he was doing and why.
Well,
They
I think
may,
there's a wider point here that the history of jazz is one of a music moving towards being probably the highest musical art form of the 20th century, but
yeah,
also being one of the most entertaining music forms in the 20th century, and that the swing era is that point where there seems to be in the middle. And when you listen to Art Tatum records, it's at once incredible and he's got all these chords and stuff, but it's also very entertaining. And I think
yeah,
there's certain musicians that then get caught in that. And who would it be? Fats Waller would be one. Nat King Cole would be one. George Shearing would be one. Errol Garner would be one.
Yeah.
Those musicians for me are heavyweight musicians, but they get perceived in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that a lot of that is misunderstandings. I mean, quiet as it's kept, there was a time where that happened to Louis Armstrong too.
Yeah,
And I think it still does amongst certain people.
without a doubt.
Because I was even asked recently by somebody, and they were being genuine. They asked me, well, what was it so great about Louis Armstrong? And mind you, this is they don't really know the music, they just, but I explained it. And I explained Pops's contribution and what he had done. And I don't, and I forgot to ask, like, what had they heard? Because a lot of times for some people, all they know is a song like What a Wonderful World. That's it. And that's all they know. They don't know
But the
anything
thing,
about.
I say to people, I say, when you listen to What a Wonderful World, what other musician who was born in New Orleans in the 1900s, a contemporary of Freddie Keppard and Sidney Bechet, could have a #1 hit in 1970? Is that a testament to just pure genius? Because there was something about him, and that aspect of jazz, I think, gets played down. I think it happens with the beboppers. I think the beboppers have a certain line, and there's a sort of it becomes elitist, and I understand why the beboppers were elitist, and I can see what it was a challenge. It's almost like punk rock in a way, but that
Mhm.
elitism is a thing that's come and bit the ass of jazz. I think that's what I feel, and
Oh
it's
yeah,
if you go, I think as I've got older, I go back to say Peggy Lee or Ella Fitzgerald. I go back to actually stuff that when I was a kid wasn't cool enough. Errol Garner. I've been listening. I think what a signature style on the piano, the chords, the way he plays, and yet it's easy listening in a way, but it's still incredibly sophisticated in what he's doing.
Oh yeah. Well, the funny thing about the Louis Armstrong "What a Wonderful World" song, and I don't know how many folks know this, but that was a hit, but it was hit in the UK. What happened was in America, the evil cretin that owned the record label said, "I hate this song. We're not marketing it." And they didn't. They just didn't. They hardly pressed any copies. And this was like when it was released in '67, I think, or
Yeah,
whatever,
something like that
'68,
is.
whatever it was. But in the UK, it was big. And so now it didn't become really big until it was in the 1980s that there was a film made entitled Good Morning Vietnam, starring Robin Williams.
Yeah.
And it was, they used that song in the movie. And I think from what I understand, it was decided, let's try to release this as a single. And then it just took off. And I think it is amazing that in the 1980s,
Yeah, it's
Louis Armstrong
incredible.
had been
They,
dead
I
for
mean, I
like
mean,
18 years, like 17, 18 years, but has its #1 record in the 1980s.
and the other thing, I mean, this is just going to end up being a big celebration of Louis Armstrong, and I'll talk to that to the cows come. I love his stuff more than any. I can't explain how much it touches me when I listen to Louis Armstrong, and I've noticed things listening to him. The other day, I was in the kitchen, and Hello Dolly came on.
Yeah.
And they play Hello Dolly, and you listen to it, everyone knows it. But that is proper New Orleans jazz. He doesn't pull any punches. He does a good solo on it. They swing. There's no extra arrangements. It's his band in a room playing a tune, But he managed to go to #1 with that as well. It's like
Yeah.
it's incredible.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think what happens is musicians tend to take, uh, especially now, and it's worse, and this is why I'm such a big critic of it. We tend to take the more simple elements for granted. And that's the thing. Because, I mean, to be honest, I mean, hell, my brother went and has stories about how he used to view Louis Armstrong. And he just thought, oh yeah, he's just this, an entertainer, this Uncle Tom. He used to think that until he tried to play his music, and he said, well, wait a minute, hold on, there's a little bit more here. But I think that musicians tend to take simple elements for granted, and I think in some ways it's funny because I think that let me see this. How do I even explain this? I think that on the one hand, you could argue that even in the 80s, that with the music that Wynn and Branford were doing, they were very influenced by the 60s, 50s a little bit, but not the decades preceding it. Not really. That would come later.
Mm.
But they were more into music like that. Now the irony You had some that was coming out of the fusion thing that didn't like that they were playing swing. They're like, why are y'all doing that? That's been done already. And so that you had that dynamic. And but I think that what happens is we take the simple elements for granted. And now in the 2000s, and this is why it is, I'm going to be a critic of that era forever because I watched this happen. And this is why when you made that video on like musicians sounding the same and why I reached out, this was why. What started to happen in the 2000s was a lot of guys, it was like the high school mentality that I grew up with took over. What I'm talking about is, all right, let me go to this tangent real quick.
Because you never covered this on the last interview, and I also wanted to get to this. I'm really glad you brought it up, and you said a few little things, and it's gone around my head. And I've actually been thinking that if we want to see where the future of jazz is, we might have to step a little bit away from this virtuoso thing and this frantic sort of race for the horizon, and actually go back to the Fat Swallows and actually see what they were doing. I'm starting to feel this very strongly because the music will just go up its own arse if it doesn't do that.
No, that's true. But here's what I mean by the mentality of one of the things that Nicholas Payton hasn't mentioned, and I don't know if he's thought about this or not, but you know, when he talks about like jazz as a four-letter word, well, here's the thing. When we were in high school, and I say we because we were at the same school for a minute. He's older than I am. He graduated like 4 years before me, I think. But here's the thing. When we were in high school, jazz was not popular at all. Like it was, you know, I mean, I have different stories of like I did this marching band thing one time because the school didn't have a marching band, but they put one together for this football game. And man, I remember I was I don't know, on a bus or something, and I was playing some rhythms just by myself. And then this drummer comes to me and says, "Hey man, we ain't playing none of that stuff here, man. That ticket, whatever you play, but no, we ain't doing that here." I mean, and I wasn't even involving them. I was just on my own, and they let me know. But no, do not bring this here. Do not. I mean, it was not a popular music. It was not liked. And there's other stories I have like that, where they just wanted to, like one time, Dr. Michael White, great clarinetist, came to the school and was playing traditional music. And I knew the guys in the band, so I was looking forward to it. And then one of the students said, excuse me, he opened up the field to questions. Does anybody have any questions? And the students says, "Do y'all take requests?" And me and another music student were like, "Oh boy, here we go. Can y'all play Do What You Want?" And we're like, damn it. That was a song by the Rebirth Brass Band, which was popular, which, I mean, and it's a great record. The name of the record is Feel Like Funkin' It Up. It was modern brass band music out of New Orleans. It was great.
Yeah.
But what I think what upset us is that, man, this guy is here to play traditional music and talk about it. Y'all just want to be entertained. I mean, y'all can hear that at any point, but y'all. So what I'm saying is, it was not a popular music, like at all. I mean, you may have the few occasional non-musicians that might be like, "Oh yeah, I kind of like that," but it was just not a popular thing. And I think that I wonder, and I haven't asked him, but I wonder if part of Payton's thing of not calling it jazz is that it did have.
Well, that's what a lot of people brought up Miles Davis not liking the word jazz, but I thought that had nothing to do with race. That had to do with the fact that the marketing of it, because as soon as that was slapped on it, it was the kiss of death. Now I can back this up with a couple of stories. When I was playing with Robert Plant, the guys that were in the band with me, we were all jazz guys. We'd play jazz steps on sound check. We would proper, you know, that's what we were. And he asked us to arrange one of his tracks, and he went off and we arranged it. When we come back, it was very jazz, you know, swinging, and there's some solos. And he just, like, his face dropped. And I said, we were like, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" And he goes, "I can't be associated with jazz. It's the kiss of death, jazz is."
Yeah.
And he goes, and then he said something that was really interesting. He goes, "You know all your heroes." He goes, "You know all your heroes." He goes, "They're my heroes too." He says, "But I've seen them all. I've seen them all in the hotel lobby playing when I went off to the big gig." And I got the feeling that the industry, that jazz is like a dirty word. It's just like, you don't want to be associated with jazz. And yet I was also with Robert so many times, and people would go. I can remember being in a pub once, and somebody went, "Oh, I love Supreme. That's a heavy album. It's hard to listen to." And Robert said, "No, one of the greatest albums ever made." So he knew the genius of it. And one of the things he said to me that he said he felt the American black community had actually at one point got sick of jazz and blues, sick of it, sick of that thing, and had pushed it away from itself
Oh yeah,
because it was just a reminder of all this stuff.
yeah. Well, not only that, I think that black people in America, like they went with where like honestly where popular music was going. And I think that in the 50s when you had uh that's the thing. I think that, and I think there's sort of some like African roots, not saying that it's African, but because I think in Africa they everything had a function, like their art would have a function to something. And I think that after a while, the music started to lose that function, like where it was tied to dance or where it started to become more about the art form, more about improvisation. And I think that black people just moved away from it and they just went with whatever was the popular thing.
Mm.
I think in the 50s with rock and roll and with the 60s with Motown. And so, that just continued. And so so when you get to the 90s when like a Nicholas Payton graduated when I was in high school, it was that same thing where most of the black people that we knew, they did not like the music. They were
No,
into
they
the
don't. They
popular
don't,
thing.
and it's like it's become the music of a sort of white elite now. That's definitely the case in this country, And I
Yeah,
think, like, Miles was trying his best to touch, in the 1980s, he was trying to go across, and it's like when he was playing Human Nature, that was precisely what jazz musicians do. You could tell that the mainstream jazz community didn't like it. I think these are the issues jazz has at the moment. Um, I think the we have to understand the popular aspects of jazz. We've got to understand all the entertainment, all that stuff that we love comes from jazz as well. And I
yeah,
think musicians, I do understand that thing of not wanting to use the word jazz in terms of a marketing thing. I don't know. I can see that totally. I can see
yeah,
that. I mean, if
yeah.
Nicholas Payton's coming from that angle,
Yeah, I think so. He hasn't said it, but I wonder if that's in the back of his mind too, because it just wasn't. And so now what I'm saying is, all of a sudden, the what I call them the post 2000 musician, they started to have that mindset where all of a sudden they didn't want to deal with playing standard songs anymore. They didn't want to do that. They didn't want to listen to older records before 2000. No, we have our thing that we're doing. We have our music that, and I'm starting to get kind of upset with these dudes because I'm like, man, this stuff is great. Man, I don't feel like listening to that. Man, my thing is just like, excuse me. And so, in fact, I remember, and I always remember this conversation about, and this is the point I was making. I was talking to a guy about, and this was one of those post 2000 musicians. He didn't want to swing or play any tunes or play any standards or none of that. But I was telling him about the importance of the traditional style and how it's important in terms of knowing music and playing and this and
mm,
that. And so then I could tell he didn't like what I was saying because then he says to me, well, here's a question. What if a pianist Andrew Hill was on the gig? See, Andrew Hill would be doing this thing and he'd be doing his shouts. And see, Andrew Hill would play himself. And I thought about that and I said, actually, that's not correct. Andrew Hill would actually play the music and then he would figure out how to fit himself within the music. I'm like, now, if you don't believe me, there's a record I want you to check out. Check out these tunes from Tony Bennett and Stan Getz, recorded in 1964. And the rhythm section is Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, and Elvin Jones. Now go ahead and listen to that. And what I realized is that they didn't understand like the function of a gig. It all became about what they wanted to do and
do.
their thing.
It's like
My
as
thing.
though I don't think these musicians, especially if they've gone through college and it's like that's a whole thing in itself. They don't
Oh yeah.
understand the mechanism of jazz and how it actually works. So, because jazz is like a nuclear reactor, isn't it? You can drop anything in it and it will create new forms. That's what it does. But
Oh
you
yeah,
have to understand. You have to understand how it works. And so, if you take something like swing, I've noticed this. I got a little bit caught up in this. The sort of it sort of comes through hip hop, and hip hop is dripping with swing in a way, but then
yeah,
the beat gets straightened out, and before you ever know, every drummer's
yep.
doing this hyper fast like drum and bass. Everyone's doing that now. One guy doing it, I'd love it, but I'm going, is everyone forgetting about swing? Because
Yeah,
when
they
I
are.
got on a jazz gig, if I was playing every now and then, they would turn around. The guys would say, "And you got good swing, you have." That was the biggest always been the biggest compliment. Because my dad used to get me to get a ride cymbal, put modern jazz quartet on Connie K.
Oh yeah,
Put Connie K on modern jazz quartet. We'd have a ride cymbal and one hand, and he'd get me to go.
exactly.
And I did that for hours on end as a kid
Yeah, no, that
because
yeah,
I
that was
loved it.
that was the way you hooked that up. Well, I think that yeah, and so the point that I wanted to make real quick, back to that Tony Bennett and Stan Getz
Yeah.
record, is, and it relates to this, is that, and I remember first hearing it, and I liked it a lot, but after a while I said, man, guys need to understand, they need to hear this, because they were playing the gig. They weren't playing it the way that they played on Wayne Shorter's Speak No Evil. They weren't doing that.
That's
They were just,
a jazz musician should know how
yeah, they
much
were
to
just,
turn up that thing that you're talking about.
yeah, they were
They
just
should
playing
know how to
standards.
do that.
So yeah, Herbie's just playing basic chords and Ron's playing basic. Elvin is basic. You kind of tell it's Elvin a little bit, but it's very basic. They're just playing the gig. It's not about my thing and this and it. I need to show off as much harmony. It's not about that. It's just about making the gig. In fact,
Look at
Janet's,
the Wrecking Crew. All jazz
yeah,
musicians calling themselves the Wrecking Crew because they thought they were wrecking the jazz because they were playing so simply. But those guys can go in and do that. And those guys, if you drop a hat, could have played Stella by Starlight if you wanted. They would have done it. Same thing with. I mean, how many jazz musicians have made money turning up to do film sessions?
oh yeah,
You look on some jazz musicians' CVs, goes, they played on that film soundtrack, and you know the film, and you think, I can't hear them.
yeah. No, they're making the gig. But I
Yeah,
think that when the 2000s hit, the mentality amongst younger players became about, well, I've got my thing and I don't need you, or I don't need to listen to this, or I don't need to. And so that's when you get the younger players that start to not know records. They start to not know the older music. It just becomes about themselves. And I have my own little theory as to why that happens. And it's a wild theory. I
go
have a
on.
musician who's making fun of me for this one, but I don't care. I think that I believe that one thing that happened was it actually involves politics, and it was the passage of the Telecommunications Act. Sounds wild, but check me out. So this was in the mid 90s. It was President Bill Clinton, and I'm not sure what his intent was, but the Telecommunications Act, what it did was that it basically consolidated media. So then, like television state, people can buy more television stations, yes, which I don't agree with any of that. But what happened was it consolidated radio. And that's when you get these big companies like Clear Channel buying 100 stations. And I think Circulus was another one owning 100 stations. And what started to happen was it became, this is this is a different version of the slave master's mentality, but now it's beyond race, but it has to do with control. We must control
Totally right.
people.
This is exactly what I think.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Oh, that's
and
exactly
so
what I think.
what happened was there's like, okay, there's people that have who worked in like things like radio, and they worked in, there's these different stories of people that hated where things went because they could see that it was all this corporate control, and there was a certain independence, go figure, that was being lost. And so one guy who worked in radio in the I think it was 98 had a story about this executive who was in charge of the music. And so he's telling this guy, well, yeah, man, the local market here, they like this. And the executive stopped him and said, no, 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 no. They're not going to tell us what's cool. We're going to tell them what's cool. And then all of a sudden, the music starts to become the same. And at the same time that that's happening was when the late 90s teen pop just exploded.
Yeah,
The
that
Britney
move from
Spears.
sort of the Radioheads to the Britney Spears suddenly happened in '99, didn't it? It was like
Yeah,
overnight. It
like
was,
all
where's
of
it
a
all
sudden.
gone? You know?
And so what's happened is that all of a sudden it's like you're either seeing super young people or celebrities, and then that's it. And I think that so what I believe happened was you had a young generation that was hearing only new music. If you watch TV, it was only new television. Because in the 80s, when I was a kid, you would see new and old. You'd hear new and old. I mean, hell, you had old people on the charts. I mean, like you'd
When
have,
I was a kid, when I was about 12 here in the UK, Oscar Peterson had his own chat show. That's why I love the guy. He had a chat show, all jazz musicians,
yeah.
and you'd sit there. My dad would watch it every single week, and they'd come and they'd have a chat and then they'd play me Joe Pass. What the guys come and sit and play and then they talk about it. And there's one, I don't know if you've seen it, the Count Basie Oscar Peterson interview
Um,
on
oh yeah, yeah,
YouTube.
yeah. I
And
have
that was
seen
from
that.
that TV show. And
Yeah,
I watch it like about twice a year. That interview is
yeah.
just
That interview was
incredible. And Count Basie's he's like a naughty man and he's winding up Oscar Peterson the whole time, just winding him up like this. It's beautiful to watch. It's
yeah, you can
absolutely
see the
incredible.
admiration
And
too.
I think the problem, what you're saying, is the fact that the thing with jazz is the most important thing I think about jazz is it it puts the individual voice center stage. You no longer have to learn the classical technique to be predictable to a composer. The great jazz musicians found a way of having compositions that encompassed people with their own voice. So Duke Ellington's
Mhm.
he's not arranging that for that C major chord. He's arranging for Johnny Hodges and Paul Gonzalez.
Right.
That
Yeah.
whole thing. But the trouble is, and this is where the racism comes in. These black jazz musicians, they never owned it. And when
Yeah.
when the sort of black community in America turned away from that, it was almost then grabbed by white British people predominantly, and before you know it, you've got rock, Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, and all those, and
Right.
they held the record company's feet to the fire, and those bands in the 70s, they were getting all the profits. And I think when that thing happened in the 1990s, and Clear Channel, all those took over everything, they went, we want it back now. We don't want to be we don't want a music form anymore where the musicians own it. And that history is now been undone, I think, because I get about 500,000 views a month, right? And
Yeah.
I'm talking about specific music. I've got a following, and my following's jazz, but it's also progressive rock. It's jazz fusion, classic rock, AC/DC. I could talk about all this music together. It's a big jumble,
Yeah.
but it's amassing people to the channel now. I've started to notice you're like a friend of the channel. So if when you're doing something in the future, you have to come to me and say, Andy, I've got this new album, I've got this, and we go on and talk about it because we have a direct line back to these like these little radio stations. It's a direct line now, but we
Yeah.
have to all work together because it's global. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? And I think that's
Uh,
where I'm coming from with this.
Yeah, it does. And I think that to finish the point that I was making and leading into yours was I think that the younger players that were coming up in like the 90s and early 2000s, I think started to get this mindset that said, well, you know what, we have our music and we don't need yours. We don't need to learn standards. We don't need to listen to the older players. We don't need, but what's interesting though, there was a part of the industry that did support that kind of thinking. Like, oh wow, like one musician was in a magazine, talking about, I got to do my thing and I got to beat me, and I was groomed to be this and screw that, and I got to have my thing. And I think that the jazz magazine is like, oh, this is great. Get him on the cover every year. Yes. So it unfortunately transfers to other students that then think, oh, well, I don't need to study John Coltrane either if he's not. And it spreads into this thing where it's all about themselves. But I think that what's happening now is I think a lot of people are sort of wondering, wait, how did we get here? I think that's what's happening now. I do think that a lot of people are like, wait, how did we get to
I
this point? I
talking
don't
to you, I feel it's to do with education because there's always a story. There's always the technical aspects, but the technical aspects support the story. And with my students, once they got into the music, they would go on the internet. They'd find out about this giant steps thing, and
right.
it becomes a thing, and they come in. But I would say to them, why was John Coltrane doing that? What was he trying to do with it? And then you start to show them the diagrams and the esoteric nature. It's almost like mysticism. It's like Pythagoras and the idea of taking the cadence of jazz, which they don't understand because they want to go straight to giant steps and not study the 251. I'm not on about studying
Exactly.
it like harmonically. What does it mean? And I say to them, what the 251 is a story. You go out of your house, something happens, there's like a bit of jeopardy or whatever, and you return back home. And I said, that is the 251. It's like breathing in and out. And Coltrane tried to do it in 3 dimensions.
Oh
And
yeah.
then they go, whoa, really? And it's like, and that's the musicians who really get it. I think it's because they want that story. It's like the beboppers, like Charlie Parker. They wanted to fly like Charlie Parker. And I think the jazz education needs to focus on the artistic part of it more, so that people will go back to these musicians with a bit of an understanding of what they achieved artistically. The statement,
Yeah.
Thelonious Monk, what was he doing? What's going on? Yeah, it's all angular, but why? What's he trying to say? Why would he
Yeah.
do it?
And also understanding the context of the day, because at that time you did have people that knew more music and understood more music, so certain things were kind of shocking for the time. So like for instance, like we were just like, for example, going back to Ahmad Jamal again, but we were talking about, well, yeah, if he plays something like Cheek to Cheek and then he like doesn't play the melody at all, but you had people who knew that song back then. So at the time, it was like, oh wow, look at what he's doing with the tune, rather than folks now who don't know it
They
and
don't
they're
know it. No.
what's going on. And I think that it's similar with giant steps. Like, why was something like that shocking? Why was that? And what was it? What was music like before? And I think musicians kind of lose sight of that, and it all becomes about, well, this is the thing I want to play, and then that's it.
But the thing is, you're going into the 1960s, of course, the jazz guys are there before anybody else. And I did an interview with another guy, and he raised a really important point, I thought. And he talked about the beat poets and how the beat poets was like the embodiment of bebop, and that moves towards psychedelia. And in the 60s, people are wanting to have an experience. And it's hard to believe when you've got like great big plasma screen TVs and surround sound systems that someone to be able to buy a John Coltrane album, go home, put it on, and then their room fills up with this guy that is moving in all directions at the same time. Because I can remember as a kid putting the TV on and Miles Davis was on, that black and white TV show, Sounds of Jazz, I think, with Coltrane on.
Oh yeah. Where
Yeah.
they do so what?
And I was
Yeah,
into metal at the time. I was into like, fast guitar
yeah.
players. And when Coltrane went to his solo, I fell off my chair. Now, that wouldn't happen to a kid now, but the thing was, there's no internet. I'm
Right.
listening to these fast guitar players. I'm listening to this, and then suddenly this guy comes on, and I'm going, "That's what I was looking for," because it was whoa. And when you watch the TV show, that's that thing when he does that lick, and it seems to go in twice, both up and down. And Miles is like goes. They can tell even Miles is a little bit whoa. It's
Oh
and all
yeah.
that stuff. All this. I think because I think there's always a bit of context and always a bit of education, and I think if people can start looking at what it means and what makes it so great, not concentrating on altered dominant chords and Lydian flat seven scales. That was
Exactly.
someone's expression. You know what I'm saying? Miles never
Exactly.
played that stuff. He's Dorian mode. It's like it's
Yeah,
it,
it wasn't about that.
it's
That's the
not
thing.
about that.
It wasn't
No,
about
it's
that. It's in there, but it wasn't about that. And yeah, I think that is a mistake that is made where it just, and that's also why it is I don't agree with the whole like old music, new music thing, which I mean, I have my own personal reasons for that. But that's another thing that started to have, well, that's that old stuff, and we don't need to deal with that. We have this new thing over here. Yeah. We're playing that. And that's definitely prevalent today, like
Oh yeah,
hard,
without a doubt. Yeah.
hardcore, harder than it's ever been. Because I think that, and I think the music that was post 2000, when I look back, and I think what I didn't like about a lot of it was that honestly, a lot of that music, the people that were playing it, it was about them. It was about themselves and their friends. And so audience didn't even matter. It was just about themselves and their friends, and and that was
Because it's
it.
become elitist, and they're playing to their elite crowd. That's what jazz is. It's become like opera in a way. It's
Yeah.
it's
Where
it's it
it,
it.
yeah, and in an interesting way, in the sense yeah, it has, where it becomes about you and your friends, and not thinking, well, what if, like for example, what is it that people liked about the music? What was it that was enjoyable? Let's try to do this well, rather than that's another reason why even the musicians say, man, audiences want to hear something new. I'm like, actually, okay, there's a couple of things wrong with that. One, they want to hear something that's great. They
They
want to
don't
hear
want to hear
something
new. That's
that's
the last
that's
thing they
that's,
want to hear is new.
that's fun. But the biggest problem I have with that is you're assuming that audiences have heard 100 years of music. You're assuming that, oh yeah, they've already heard Louis Armstrong. They want to hear something else. Never mind the fact that you have people that don't even know that music exists. And you have people that in a lot of cases are hearing it for the first time if they hear it live. So you're talking about new? There, I mean, even when I think back to, even when earlier Winton was criticized, oh well, this stuff isn't really new and it's just coming out of, and I'm like, how many of the people in the audience really know about Miles's second quintet? And are they really going to know how an album like Vita Kilimanjaro influenced? Are they really going to know that? No. And I
But the
think
thing is with
that
them.
gets lost.
I was there when Winton's band came out, and I'm really removed from it. Yeah, he was influenced by the sort of post-hard bop, Time No Changes, a little bit of that, a little bit of modal stuff. That's where he's coming out. But that band didn't sound like that,
Yeah.
and
No,
like
it
Jeff
didn't.
Tate Watts, he was post-fusion without a doubt. He's playing like
Oh
that,
yeah.
but
But
he's
you know what? I've got
post-fusion. You can tell. It's like
but yeah, well, I've got to,
blew
oh
my
yeah, yeah.
mind. Blew my
In fact,
mind.
yeah, no, that was definitely, in fact, I have a funny story about that. In fact, it related to the story. I think I may have told it, like the story about Romantic Warrior, about the Romantic Warrior album. Well, before that, I remember one day my father just said, yeah, man, Shane Watts gets this stuff out of fusion. I was like, what? What do you? But the thing is, I thought fusion was like the smooth jazz of the 80s. That's what I thought it was. So I'm like, what are you talking about? I didn't say that, but I was like, what? So then when I heard Romantic Warrior, I said, oh, okay. All right, maybe. Finally, it was, ironically enough, I was in New York recording with Marcus Roberts for Portraits in Blue, and I went into this CD store that was not far from the hotel. And I have this rule that if I look down and see a record, I just buy it. Like if it's something that I need to check out, I look down and, oh, Joni Mitchell, Hajara. Yeah, I need to get this. I'll just buy it right then and there. In fact, that happened to me with Brand X also. What if they have, oh, Unorthodox Behavior? Yeah, I'm buying it.
Oh, that's the one you want.
If I see it, I'm like, I'm buying it. So anyway, I was in a store and I look down and I see this record and I'm like, this looks important. It's Billy Cobham, Spectrum. Right? Let me buy this. And I put it on. And of course, it starts with that fast shuffle. I'm like, okay, we're in for a ride here. And then it was the first solo on the record. And I said, Jeff Tate Watts. That's when I was like, that's what my father was talking about. This
Yeah,
right here.
I can
And I
hear a
think
ton.
that,
I could hear a ton of Lenny White, I think, and
oh
also
yeah,
I could
man, Billy
hear obviously
Cobham, Penny
Tony Winter,
White,
but I
Narada
could hear
Michael Baldwin.
Alphonse Mouzon,
Yeah, just that whole
11th
era.
House. That sort of hitting everything all at the same time. That
Right.
explosive thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's yeah. Well, Winston wasn't actually. He never has done. Gone back to the past. He never has done, and I'm old enough to hear it now. But I felt it at the time. There was for a start. It was more aggressive in a way. That was
Oh yeah.
fiery. I mean, here in the UK, they did a documentary on Winton. I was a metaler. This is this time when I was a metaler, and I heard Coltrane. I heard a whole bunch of stuff. But seeing your
Oh,
brother,
catching a snake.
yeah, that was the one, yeah. And I watched that,
Yeah.
and I went, because my dad had brought me up on jazz, and I was rebelling it, and I watched Winter, and I thought, yeah, jazz is the best. Stop fighting, stop fighting it. Joe Morello he's a good drummer. Stop fighting. Ian Pace is good, but Joe Morello's something else. And it's all these drummers that my dad had brought me up playing. And and he had Crosswinds by Billy Cobham in his collection. That's
Oh
how cool
yeah.
my dad was.
Oh yeah.
So I
Yeah.
went
Yeah. I've
I
got
went through
crosswind.
and put on Crosswinds. Bloody hell,
Oh yeah.
1716.
Prime Cobham. In fact, I think Tane mentioned that record in an interview once.
Got Crosswinds.
Yeah, crosswinds. I think he just straight up said, "Oh yeah, I was in the crosswinds and from Billy Cobham." I was like, "Oh okay." So, but yeah, no, yeah. Cobham was definitely hitting it, no doubt about it. But I think that but yeah, I think that what happened was, in the 2000s, I think guys started to get into this. We have to do this new thing rather than just playing the music on a high level, and whatever you discover and whatever you hear, just go for that rather than trying to force this
Yeah.
new thing, or we need
They
to
they
move forward.
We need to talk about the history. I think next time I get you on, Jason, if you're up for it, let's just get into the history. Let's talk it through with you being at the
Yeah.
center of it, part of one of the big jazz families in New Orleans, right? And me being on the outside. I think it's a great mixture. We both know about the jazz. It's interesting because I think what it shows is that this is the power of the music. Because I wanted to talk about whether jazz is black or not. I don't give a toss now. I don't care. We're just having too much of a conversation. I just want to talk about the jazz with you. I
Oh
don't
yeah,
care anymore. Listen,
yeah,
everybody, where
absolutely.
are you? I don't care anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, my thing was to just talk about why, and there's those that agree and disagree, and
Yeah,
why,
yeah,
and so forth. But at the same time, like music is a unifying thing. I also think that's why it is even some in marketing. I don't. There's some in marketing now with, like, especially with pop music. I don't think they want young people discovering what jazz is about. I don't think they want to do that. So what they tell them is, "Oh, that's for old people. You don't want to hear that."
well, the thing, I had the luxury of teaching kids and loving jazz, and I had to teach, and I chose to do this unit. It was called 20th Century Popular Music, and I was
Yeah.
supposed to teach them from 1950 to now. I started around about 1865, right?
Mhm.
All the way through it, and I would play them different tracks, and it was interesting to see what would light those kids up, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, there's all the fusion stuff, and the guys who are into guitar, you could play them certain guitarists, they couldn't believe it. The unifying stuff would be Louis Armstrong, Ella
Yep.
Fitzgerald,
Yep.
Sarah Vaughan. I can remember I put Sarah Vaughan on
Yeah.
once, and you could hear a pin drop because they just
Yeah.
couldn't believe. They're watching X Factor, they're seeing all these things, and then suddenly they see Sarah Vaughan,
Yep.
and they can't believe it. And you think kids won't be like that? And yes, they will. They will if they're into music, which is what you've got. And I was in a lucky position to find out the stuff that would get people going. Big band jazz. People, I just had a big stereo in there and a huge PA, actual live PA. I
Yeah.
put Count Basie on really loud.
Oh yeah.
And then what
Yeah.
was because I can remember how it affected me as a kid. I can remember my dad taking me to see a big band and the power to hear.
Yep.
I played Nice Jazz Festival with Robert Plant once, and he had high standards for music, and we were playing. It was us, and we were on with Booker T and the MGs. We were headlining it.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
headlining Nice
Yeah.
Jazz Festival. And when we finished, we walked over, and over Nice Jazz Festival, playing open air, was the Count Basie band, Butch Morris on drums,
Oh yeah.
and no PA. And I can remember
Right.
we were listening to it and going, "This sounds amazing, doesn't it?" And he was going, "God, there's no PA. There's power, but
Yep.
not through a PA. It's power, sheer
Yeah.
power.
Yeah.
Incredible." And I just think having this conversation with you, we need to get on here and talk about why we love jazz and pick different musicians. To pick Ahmad Jamal and just have a whole hour on what made him so great, and why people don't listen to him, what's so You know, because Ahmad Jamal's a sort of jazz musician I think a lot of people would really love if they knew about him.
Oh yeah, no, he was somebody that was definitely successful, and and one album that is intriguing, and I kind of regret I never had a chance. I did get a chance to meet Ahmad Jamal. Through the years, he'd come to New Orleans. I'd see him.
Mm.
I'd be with my father, or I saw him a couple of times with Marcus Roberts. The last time I saw him with Marcus, and it was a great conversation. But and he was breaking down some stuff that was unbelievable. Where he was saying how we don't really create, we discover. I was like, damn, okay. This is why you're Ahmad Jamal. But the one album that will always intrigue me is this album called The Awakening. And The Awakening is an album that came out in 1970. And I think it was at a time where I think Ahmad's music was, I guess you could say, being overshadowed, because it happens where it happens in movies where you'll have movies that won't get a certain amount of attention, but then years later it does, or TV shows. And I think with music, you'll have music that's paid attention to, and then some not. Like certain parts of guys' careers, maybe it wasn't as paid attention to because they're established and they've been around and we take it for granted. But anyway, so it comes out. I don't think that album was really acclaimed in 1970. I
I've
don't
never
think.
heard of this album.
Yeah, that's what I mean. And so I think I think when he was doing the Pershing, but not for me, that was acclaimed. It was popular. Poinciana was a big record. But I think that period of Ahmad, like late 60s, he had made these great albums, and I don't think they were really I don't think as heralded is the only way I can put it. Unlike when Miles did Bitches Brew, which that was a big deal, or when the Tony Williams Lifetime first album came out, or I think those things were getting attention, but I think Ahmad, because he was more established, I don't think it was getting the same amount of attention. Now, in the 80s, Impulse Records, they started to release CDs. It was like the very beginning of reissuing albums on CD. And the one album they released was what started to happen was guys started to slowly talk about, hey, have you heard this album, The Awakening? This is like happening, slowly but surely. And then they reissued it again. Uh, and and then one of those tunes got sampled by this rapper named Nas. It was I think The World Is Yours, and it was a hit. And I think that there's a small niche inside of that community that does go and check out
Oh, without a doubt.
samples. And they're
Without a
like,
doubt.
oh, and I think that the album, The Legend, just grew and grew over. I mean, it's an incredible record, but I don't think it was that big of a deal when it
I'm
came
going
out.
to check this out. I will check it out, and I
The
might.
Awakening. Yeah, it's happening. And it's a classic. But I think it was acclaimed later. It wasn't acclaimed at the time that it came out. I think at the time it came out, I don't want to say it was buried. I just think that there was other music that was getting people's
Mm.
attention. And I don't
But
think,
the thing is, it does find a way. Did he make any money off that track?
yeah, I don't even know. That's the thing. I don't even know, because a lot of times, and going back to again, you'd have like labels would own it, or somebody else would have.
Yeah, it's not right, is
Or,
it?
yeah, and that goes back to the same thing with the systems. Is that you've
Yeah.
had, that and I think that that's at the root of a lot of the
I take it.
conversation
Yeah, and I haven't
at the
talked
end of the
about this
day.
at all. I'm coming at it from this sort of like almost like I want the world to be lovely and everyone to get on and not have any divisions between people. And I'm like
Oh
that one of
yeah,
these guys, But
yeah,
there's the
but
business, and the business is something else. And it's like
and I think that you've
luck of the
had,
draw, isn't it? Luck of the
yeah.
draw.
And I think that that's another part of it, is that at the end of the day, a lot of the folks that have owned the stuff have been white. So, but I don't know. Now, I do think that anyway, I think that he was very established, and I think that he was so. It's the kind of thing. Honestly, I don't know if he necessarily would have been looking for that. So,
I
I
would
don't
have.
know if he made money off it or not.
I would have.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah, that's the thing. I don't know, but I think Ahmad was doing fine to where I don't know if he necessarily, if that
When
really mattered.
I
But
worked on the UK rap scene in the early 2000s, and we had this guy, Damien, his name was. He had 50,000 LPs in his house, and he knew every sample on
Hmm.
every hip hop record, and he was deep into it, deep. And
Right.
eventually we pulled him in, and he set up an urban music um, HND qualification, high level qualification in sort of dance music. All they studied was jazz. It was interesting. All everything was jazz. He
Yeah.
was going, and he would say things like, "You go, what's your favorite Weather Report album, Andy?" And I go, "Black Market," and he went, "No, no, Sweet Nighter." He goes, "That's the one, Sweet Nighter," because that's the one everyone sampled, And he had this different take on every single album, So it's like
That's
Mavish
funny.
Inner
Sweet Nighter.
Worlds.
Yeah.
Inner Worlds is where the sample comes from. It's like Unfinished Sympathy by Massive Attack. That's Inner Worlds.
Oh,
Ralph
okay.
Armstrong, the great Ralph Armstrong, being sampled. He made some
Yes.
money.
Yes. I've had a chance to. I actually know Ralph Armstrong. Yeah.
I'd
I've
love
played
to
with him
get him
some.
on
It was
this
great.
channel. He did email me, and he said, "Give us a call," and I don't know what he meant. I thought it's a Zoom interview, Ralph, but he has made contact. I'd love to have him on because not only he's another underrated bass player, isn't he? He's so important in 1970s jazz and fusion, but his knowledge of acoustic
Oh yeah.
bass
Yeah.
is encyclopedic, isn't it? I want to get into that. I want to see how the jazz
Yeah. Yeah. No,
acoustic
he's
bass
one of
relates to
those
classical.
seasoned. Yeah, one of those seasoned cats that really knows the music. So,
There's
and
so
I
many
remember
of them.
one time we did have.
I
Yeah,
think I
we did
think I
have a
think
gig
we've got
together
we've
where
got
we.
to a natural
It's great.
conclusion. I think we definitely have. We tried to keep on subject, but it hasn't happened. But where it's gone is far more interesting as far as I'm concerned. It's lovely to have you on, Jason. Will you come back again every now and then? I want you as a regular. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because
Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, there's one other thing, the one other story I just wanted to tell you. I thought about you when I was thinking about this. So, and this goes into a whole other thing. But it reminded me of something. So there was that there was that sort of blow up, if you will, involving that vocalist, that young lady, Leve,
low
right?
fail. Yeah, we're never going to pronounce
Yeah,
it right. We're
but
too
like,
old. Low fail,
yeah,
low
yeah,
fail.
yeah, I think it's Leve.
Yeah.
But anyway, but anyway, I thought of it. Let me see where to even start with that one, because uh, I had just discovered recently that I actually had liked one of her TikTok videos from like a few years back, but she hadn't blown up yet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I was like, oh, wait a minute, okay. And it's interesting because I think that a lot of things and points of views that she's had, I think, is more from her fan base, actually.
Mm.
And one of those things reminded, like when you start to hear folks talking about jazz and saying things like, well, this music is really hard to find. And, well, there's people that aren't. But anyway, the only reason I mentioned that is that it reminded me of this conversation of these people. And this is why I wanted to tell you the story. I was on a flight with some people, and I think that they grew up in the UK, and we were telling them like, yeah, y'all guys are musicians. Like, yeah, we play jazz stuff, and it's like, yeah, we never really checked that out. No, yeah, and they made a strange the way they not the they said a statement in a very strange way. They said, we grew up in the 1960s, but the music was changing. I was like, what? It was like they were being defensive for no reason, but the music was changing. Okay, the Stones and Beatles, it was changing during the '60s. Like, well, yeah, okay. I mean, there's always things that have been changing in music
Mm.
over blah blah blah. And so then, so we're talking, and then at some point they said, we were talking about that they didn't listen to jazz, and then they said, besides, there was no jazz in the UK in the '60s. And I was like, yeah, there was. What are you talking about? There was no jazz in the. Of course there was. And I said, man, the only reason you would be saying that is because the music wasn't in these mainstream magazines. And the person said, you're right. He just immediately agreed with it. But I was like, what do you mean there was no jazz in the? What are you talking about?
But I think it's not true because Ginger
Of
Baker
course it
and
is.
Jack Bruce in Cream were just straight jazz musicians. Straight jazz. I mean, Jack Bruce could play through any jazz standard. They were proper jazz players. Graham Bond. The rock music, it comes straight out of jazz. It's straight out
Oh
of
yeah.
jazz, and that magical bit. And what Ginger and Jack did behind, Eric Clapton basically playing like Freddie King. That is a very important thing. And then Hendrix does the same thing, and you got Mitch Mitchell behind it playing like Tony Williams. They were all
Oh
jazz
yeah.
players. All those guys were jazz players. They were jazz players.
Oh yeah. No, you
And
yeah.
and then behind that, and I always say this, and this is where all this putting lines up affects the way people see it. At that time, we got Joe Harriet, and Joe Harriet should have changed it. I mean, he innovated about 3 times.
Huh.
Joe Harriet was playing free, at the
Mm-hmm.
same time as Ornette Coleman, but in a completely different way. And this guy was a proper genius. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're a British jazz musician and you die young, which he did,
No.
it gets forgotten. It gets forgotten. So there's that. You're so right. There's so much going on. It's an international form. It's an international form now. It's
Yeah.
all over the world. We all love it.
But that was funny when they said that. I'm like, what do you no, that's no.
Yeah,
But
and then
I
change their mind so quick.
yeah, oh yeah. But I think that again, it's like when folks don't hear, oh well, I guess it doesn't exist. Like, no, it does. It's just
Yeah,
it's not being marketed directly to you every single day. So, but no, anyway, I thought you'd find that and get a trip out of that.
it's always there. Jazz is always there. It's like it's always hiding, and I think there's a lot of jazz in hiding at the moment.
Yeah.
And
Oh yeah.
the jazz world has got so conservative that it won't open up to certain things. I think one of the things that's come out of this conversation is an appreciation and a respect for the history, and but also having a lack of prejudice about the future. Those two things together is what we need at the moment. Jazz musicians need to have a respect for the history, understand where it comes from, to
Yeah.
understand the mechanism of jazz. I think to know how it works. It's like everything. It's like my YouTube videos. I never plan what I'm going to do. They're all
Mm-hmm.
completely improvised. I try and get in there and I try and surf on the top of this thing until I reach a point where I feel like I've said something, and it's exactly like trying to do a solo in jazz. You get in there and you try and find something, a thread, and then you
Yeah.
try and make a statement. And you might do it in 2 minutes, might do it in 10, but you're going to
Right.
try and get in there and get to a point. So you've said something, and that carries on for me in absolutely everything I do, whole life. And I've been through a lot recently. Lost my job and had to get a new career up and going. And you suddenly
Oh
realize you're improvising the whole time, and you
yeah.
don't know what's coming up,
Yeah.
and you're going to roll with the punches. And you've got, you have to know to be able to just not be tense. And all that
Right.
stuff as a jazz musician, when you're trying to play. I mean, I did interview Scott Henderson, and he said some incredible stuff about, being a jazz musician and trying to improvise and having the fight of not trying, of being in the
Right.
moment, of not getting in the way, and how difficult that is to do.
Right.
But that's the skills. That's what jazz is about, and it carries on into real life. And I think we need it because our culture's changing at the moment. We are going
Yeah.
to a new place. We don't know where it's going to be.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think that's why it's so yeah, things are crazy because there is a lot of change, for better and worse simultaneously. That's sort of what's going on.
God, I mean, we're calling it like people in the UK are calling America like as though it's like a TV series. It's like we're watching
Yeah,
this mad TV show that's insane.
but yeah, no, it is, and some of it is you have folks from TV rather,
Like, what's going to happen next?
yeah,
UFOs land? What's going to happen?
right. Most definitely. Yeah, it's a lot of wild stuff happening. Then you have the folks that are being elevated that shouldn't be. You have a lot of that going on too.
None of them are any good.
Yeah, no.
I mean, it's like I just before we came on, I I saw a photograph of Kamala Harris with that George Soros's son with his arm round her, and I was like, oh God.
With who?
George Soros's son, the guy that
Oh
his dad
wow.
runs the he runs the
North
world.
Star.
You know, we won't get into all that. I'm sick
Yeah,
of politics on mine.
yeah.
I'm just going
Didn't
to get
really
back to chatting
have it,
about the music, I
but
think.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Let's call it a day because it's God knows what the time is. It's absolutely pitch black here, I tell you. I
Yeah,
mean,
I think it's late there.
yeah, if I switch my light off,
Right.
I don't like doing that. I did an interview with you at night because you're important, Jason, and I jumped when you said, but normally I like to do him in the day because this light's making me look very
Right.
oh, I don't know, but you look really good. Right,
Thanks a
I'm going
lot.
to switch
Yeah,
it
I'll
off
try to
there.
figure out another time that
Thanks for coming on, Jason. Say bye to everybody. Say bye to Jason,
absolutely.
and we'll try and get him
Bye.
on. You know,
Always
next
a pleasure.